2024. We would like to begin this meeting by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Inca, Kappa, and Silk people. Adoption of minutes. Committee of the Whole meeting minutes, May 21st, 2024. Recommendation that the minutes of the Committee of the Whole meeting held on May 21st, 2024 be adopted. Councillor Petrosi, Councillor Egan. Any errors or omissions? Any questions? Anything like that? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. General matters, unfinished business, new business, 5.1 BC Housing. Mr. Tyler Baker, Director, Regional Development, Interior Region, BC Housing, to present. Mr. Baker. I'll just get to press that button and I'll zonk you in. There we go. You're good to go.
Great.
Oh, okay, good.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. So thanks for having us here today. I'm Tyler Baker. I'm the Director of Development for the Interior Region of the province. And I'm here with Nanette Drobot, who's the Director of Operations for the Interior. We work together like managing the interior region of the province, which matches the area that Interior Health covers. So we're responsible for bringing on new housing units in that area and operating them. So you'll hear from both of us today, both sides of that equation. Land acknowledgement, you've already covered that. And so today, we're going to be talking about the housing system generally, the types of programs that BC Housing offers, and the types of housing that we deliver and how they relate to one another. And we'll speak about the current housing and shelter currently in operation in Merritt. Next slide. So we think about the housing programs that we deliver along housing spectrum or housing ecosystem. We use the word ecosystem sometimes because it's not necessarily linear. People aren't always moving from rental housing to owning a house. There's a lot of back and forth, and that goes for the shelter system, the supportive housing, and everything. But I'll discuss it in a linear method anyways. So on the left-hand side of the housing spectrum, we have programs that address homelessness. So these are shelters for people who are experiencing homelessness. We operate a number of different types of models where, in a smaller community like Merritt, we try to meet people where they are in terms of shelter so that there's a very low barrier for people to come into the shelter and receive services. That's to allow people to engage with the kind of supports that a shelter can offer, including health supports, housing stability, connections to work or family. It can mean all sorts of things to different people. But the main thing that BC Housing is trying to target with a shelter is to get people somewhere stable so that they can maintain their housing and move on, maintain their shelter in the shelter and move on to more permanent housing. So the next step is, in the way we're thinking about it here, is housing with support services. So this is supportive housing. In Merritt, we have an example of this. It's long-term housing, so people who live there, it's their permanent home. They sign a regular lease with the operator and they pay rent every month. But it comes along with supports for them to maintain that housing in the long term. Those supports, again, can look different for different people. It can be health supports, mental health, addictions, connections to work opportunities, a meal program, things like life skills, learning how to, take care of your space or make food for yourself, those kind of things to help people maintain their housing stability. The largest number of units BC Housing delivers is in the social housing spectrum, part of the spectrum. So that's housing for people who can live independently, but just need assistance with paying the rent. So we provide ongoing subsidies to keep that rent affordable. That kind of housing can target families, seniors, women and their children who are at risk of family violence, or Indigenous people. So we have all sorts of different programs within that social housing part of the spectrum. We also deliver rental assistance in the private market through rent supplements. So this is providing individuals with additional rent payments so that they can afford what the market is charging. So recognizing that we can't build housing fast enough, there's some places where there's rental housing available. It's just a mismatch between people's incomes and the rent that's being charged. So we have one program for seniors and one program for families and individuals to meet that private market rent. On the other side of the spectrum, BC Housing has a new program called BC Builds, which was formerly Housing Hub. This is to provide rental housing at low end of market rates. So that kind of housing is affordable for middle income earners. So that middle income is determined based on the community, what an average income is, and we target the rents to that. So that program, we partner with for-profit developers or nonprofit developers, and that type of housing is maintained through restrictions on title to keep that housing affordable for some amount of time. We also have affordable homeownership programs, but those we're kind of moving away from at the moment and focusing really on the rental housing.
I was just gonna say, I don't know if you're gonna mention it, but in order to get into the programs like for Community Housing Fund or for the Indigenous Housing Fund, we do call outs all the time. BC Housing does expressions of interest or requests for proposals. And so there's, you know, a window of opportunity for communities to get their proposals in. It really rests on the back of the nonprofit. So a community with strong nonprofits who can develop proposals is really an important mechanism for communities to actually achieve more social housing in their community. So we're always talking to cities about what they know about their nonprofits, how do they work with the nonprofits, how do they build their nonprofit capacity, because we know that nonprofits are stretched and you know, it's difficult to recruit new board members. It's all volunteer, of course. So that's where some of the partnership also happens, which I'll speak to in the next slide.
Yeah, okay, fine.
So this is all about how we work together, knowing that, you know, what we do as a funding entity at BC Housing is not done in isolation. So we do work with over 800 housing providers across the province. In the interior region, we probably have a third of that, maybe 300 or so, that we work with. Of course, local government is the key around zoning, planning, some different incentives in terms of the construction process to get projects going. In terms of health authorities, we're constantly looking to the health authority to partner. Tyler was talking about some of the services that can be provided at shelters. That's where the health authority can come in. We don't, as shelter operators, we don't provide health services directly, but we provide the place for health services to come into and do that in reach that that they need to do to provide those health services to community members. The province, of course, is in there, and you know, we represent the Ministry of Housing in terms of what we do, but there's lots of other ministries that play a role in housing, and I'm thinking particularly about the Ministry for Social Development and Poverty Reduction. So not only do they provide the shelter portion for folks, but they also have the community integration specialists, which is the case in Merritt and all other communities in the interior, where they're actually out there in the encampments looking to support people with getting some income security. And then, of course, the federal government is increasingly playing a role in the work that we're doing and providing some funding to support some of the programs that we have. So as you can see, there's lots of pieces to this puzzle on how we work together and how we try and deliver more housing in communities. So next slide. So we got research to do a little bit of a snapshot of currently what's in place in Merritt, and there is quite a lot actually when if you compare Merritt's population to other communities in the interior, and we kind of compare what other communities have. So as you know, with the shelter, it was a COVID related initiative. We did a lot of COVID related shelters within the interior region because there was such a significant homeless population across the different communities in the interior. So the Desert Inn is a reflection of that, and we have not migrated to another location. So at the time that we started there's 30 funded shelter beds. Currently, we're at 25.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just had a question where you have under the affordable housing, under the social housing program, because I noticed that Tradewinds was there right along with Phelan. Now, I'm very familiar with the Phelan, obviously, because I'm on their board, but Tradewinds, Ask Wellness had been running that, and it used to be mostly seniors, but in the last number of years, we had mixed population in there. A lot of the people that were in there were from the Juniper House. So is that still the case, or is it now officially for seniors again?
Tradewinds has always been for seniors or people under 55 with a disability. It's always been that way. And so disabilities take many shapes and forms and diagnoses. And it's a mixed building for sure. It's not supported though, in the same way that Juniper House does. We have actual staffing support to support programs and services, whereas Tradewinds doesn't have. I mean, the supports there is more like regular property management in terms of like building maintenance and grounds maintenance and an admin person to coordinate the tenants.
Because the feedback that some of us have been getting from Tradewinds is that some of the seniors who had been residents were concerned living there because of the mixed substance abuse problems that had been there in past. And I don't know if that had been the case. So I thought perhaps it wasn't simply a seniors and persons with disabilities type of housing. So that's why I wanted to confirm that, because the perception in town was that maybe it was to accommodate residents who were more appropriately housed at Juniper that had.
No, it still is characterized the same. And what we do find is what Tyler was talking about, across the continuum, people move.
Yeah.
And so at Juniper, if they don't need that level of support, if they don't need a meal program, if they don't need staffing there to support them with their activities of daily living, maybe they're a better fit at Tradewinds where there is no support and they can manage with the, circumstances that they have.
Okay.
So we do see a lot of movement, and certainly in Merritt, there is a lot of movement between different housing, just as people's needs change.
Mm-hmm.
We try and match their needs to the housing that they live in.
Okay, thank you for
that. So just on this, I noticed there was lots of maybe conversation about this slide. So I'm not sure if you have questions about this slide. Maybe we can get to them later, but it just shows some of the different housing sites that we have in Merritt, and there's quite a few actually. We have Nicola Meadows. We have rent supplements at Nicola Meadows. And then of course, Juniper House, which is a fairly new, beautiful building. I just drove by it on my way here. Beside that, of course, is Cedar. And then you've got the other social housing that's noted, like Tradewinds, like Cedar, like I just said, Phelan House, Sumac Gardens, Tamarack Gardens, Three Eagles. And then we also have under construction the Nicola Native Lodge Society. And then, of course, the big building on Walters.
Councillor Sherney.
So there are quite a few units there. So do you think that for the size of Merritt, we have an adequate amount of social housing?
I don't think any community has an adequate number of social housing units. I think there's a need across the entire continuum, and especially as affordability continues to be an issue, and we see more and more issues around low vacancies. I think you will always be in an environment where you need more social housing units.
Councillor Richard.
I also, sorry for all the questions, but I also noticed under the affordable housing, you have the Walter Street location. And so of course, when they came with their original plan, they had asked council last term, which I was on, to give them an exception because they wanted to reduce parking and have 95 units. And then that never happened because they didn't have their 19 subsidized units. They only went with the 75. And some of the residents in there, it's not at full capacity. So of course, people aren't exactly paying affordable rents. Like they're substantial amounts that people are paying for some of their units. Not that I'm trying to be critical, but when we're told some of the rents, I don't find that's what I'd call affordable, especially knowing what some of the rents are at the other locations that people are paying, which I'm not, of course, going to say, but you know what I'm talking about. So this is the concern, like to me, when they had talked about rents of $1,000 a month for a small 1-bedroom or bachelor apartment in the new unit, I would be surprised if there was actually anyone paying that low rent there now. So is that in fact the mandate? Because I didn't think Walter Street was under that mandate because they actually didn't build an well,
Olympic Village.
well, that says Water Street, but I think it's supposed to be Walter's.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Missing the L.
Yeah. So, you know, because they had to come in 2019 with the idea that they would have some subsidized units, but they didn't in fact build the 95, they only built the 75. And I don't even think it's at capacity yet. It could be. Yeah.
So yeah, that's a project under the Housing Hub program. So that's targeting middle income earners. So it's lumped in with all of those social housing properties, but it really is closer to the right-hand side of the housing spectrum. So it's affordable to people who are earning middle income in Merritt. So yes, it's high. The rents are totally going to be higher than some of those other properties we see, but it's tied not to what other affordable rental housing rents are. It's tied to the broader picture of what incomes are in the community. So it's trying to fill that gap between what what people can afford to buy, like buying a home,
With a mortgage.
or the rental that's available. So it's trying to fill that gap in the market.
I mean, yeah, I guess it's hard to say what would be in the future. I mean, if PC Housing ever had units in Walters where they did it like the other communities with a rental program based on income and anything like that, that would be a great building, but that's not how that one's operated now, from what I understand.
So that one, the structure of that, typically under the Housing Hub, I'm not super familiar with the details of that, but typically under the Housing Hub program, the financing that we provide for the construction comes at a lower interest rate. So that lower interest rate allows the developer to save a little bit, and that savings gets translated into lower rents for the first 10 years. So it's not permanent affordable housing like some of these other ones where BC Housing is on title permanently and those rents are secured indefinitely. It's really for that initial period to secure affordability. And then over time, as people move out after that initial period, the rents can go up. So in the long term, that program is really just meant to get more rental housing. Really, that's the purpose of the plan. The initial affordability is a help, but the long-term purpose of that is really just rental housing.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Egan.
Yeah, thank you very much. This discussion begs the question, what does BC Housing consider an average income in Merritt?
CEO.
So the mean household income in Merritt, I believe, is about $68,000 a year. So if we were talking with the national definition of affordability, that would be $1,700 a month that one would pay for their housing, which should include rent or mortgage, utilities, and insurance.
That's based on the national 30%.
That's based on the 30%. If our mean household income is $68,000 a year.
But we now know we're more at 56%, right?
Yeah, well, I'm not paying 30% of mine.
Yeah.
I'm paying a lot more than 30%.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Councilor Butcher. Oh, just hold on.
just to clarify then, so what do you mean 50? What was the?
So if in a dream world in Canada, you're never supposed to spend more than 30% of your income. But right now, the way it is right now, it's
Spending a lot
56,
more.
it's about 56%. So it's higher than it needs to be.
Okay, I thought you were talking about the mean average.
No,
I thought you were talking
no.
about income level.
no,
Okay,
this is the
Wow.
national dream.
And so just as a point of clarification for our affordable housing programs in general, like places like Three Eagles.
Where's Three
Juniper, Three Eagles is the townhouse right beside
And Petrocan,
Shell and just by
right behind the Petrocan,
NVIT.
going on the way to NVIT.
Oh, right there. Okay, okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so those ones are 30% of a person's income, and it goes by the housing income limits. So that is the limits that are created per town. And that's what BC Housing uses as part of how we determine who's eligible for housing. So that's sort of a standard that's done across the province.
So when we were talking 56%, we're talking about people who are not depending on social housing. That's just everybody who has a job and is looking for a house. That's, so we're working to try and change that. And I think every community is, because we know it's way too expensive to live in this. Councilor Petrosi.
Thank you for the presentation. Is the Nicola Native Lodge, is that the one on River Ranch Road? Are they spoken for, the 52 units already, or do we know?
They wouldn't be tenanted yet. No, that happens closer to that.
Okay, so nothing right now, like how many people will be actually living there, but
Yeah,
there are 52 units though
they will be
available.
50.
Right, thank you.
CEO.
Would you be able to send or supply us with some of those indicators that you were just discussing?
Housing income
Yeah.
limits.
Yeah, we have a new housing project that we're working on, and this is good data for us to have as to how it's being decided by BC Housing, so.
So the other bucket too is you talk about the housing income limits. So that's for the deep affordability. Then the programs like Community Housing Fund, where we're targeting a low end of market for a portion of the units, then we go by a low to moderate income threshold. And that's based on numbers from Stats Canada. And so I can give you those too. Yeah.
Councilor Baxter.
With Nicola Meadows being up for sale, would that, if they get sold, will their prices go up?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, for us, we have rent supplements in with the owner, which means that we supplement, I forget, 15 or so,
60.
16, thank you. 16 or so folks to ensure affordability for their rent portion. And so we would just be negotiating with the new owner to try and make sure that those rent supplements continue.
And I'll just like, there's another program that's not administered by BC Housing called the Rental Protection Fund, which is meant to help nonprofit societies buy properties like that to keep them affordable. So it's not directly managed by BC Housing, but if any of you know of a group that's interested in purchasing that, we can make that connection and try to make that happen. Because the purpose of that program is really to protect housing that already exists from being bought up and made more expensive. So that comes as financing for a nonprofit group.
And it's happening. I mean, there was just an announcement a few weeks back for an apartment building that CMHA Vernon is going to purchase with proceeds from that rental protection fund. So really to create stability for those 30 or so tenants who are living there who are facing having to leave because a developer was going to come in. So we are seeing it in the interior. This isn't just a Lower Mainland fund that's being administered. The other tool that we have is the issue of rent supplements. And as Tyler was saying, we cannot build our way out of it. So we're trying to lever the private market to the greatest extent possible. That's effective when you have a higher vacancy rate, and it's not effective when you don't. So we continue to have rent supplements. They are well utilized in the Merritt community. So not only, I think we have 70, and they're going to a cross section of folks. It could be working families, it could be the seniors, and it could be people experiencing homelessness.
There's one more step.
We do. Okay. Next slide, please, Linda. So this is just a slide that we always provide when we're talking to municipalities because it is top of mind. Homelessness is on the rise across Canada and certainly across the interior region. We are seeing lots of people in shelters. We are seeing oversubscribed shelters. We are seeing the need for permanent shelters in every single community. In the last 24 months, in the last 2 years, I would say we are Tyler and I's, one of our main focus areas has been around creating shelter spaces in communities that has never been an issue before. So it's an area of new work and lots of conversations with folks like you to figure out how do we build shelters and how to create projects after the shelters so that we have a bit of a process and people don't get stuck in shelters, because we know that getting stuck in shelters is not good for folks, and it doesn't lead them to get into housing where they're going to be successful. So so this just sort of talks about that process. And in Merritt, we started with a COVID shelter at the Desert Inn, and we haven't been able to move from there. Currently exists. And we always talk about shelters being a conduit or a gateway to housing. But of course, you need that housing and you need that system to support people to move forward. So in the system that as it is here in Merritt, we do have some buildings and we do have rent supplements that we are able to transition people to. And we have had some success stories from the shelter in terms of people transitioning from shelter into housing, into work, into volunteerism. So.
Councillor Hogan.
So I have two questions. The first question, it's about housing projections. So I'm not sure when was last time BC Housing did a study and what was the result. It was regarding the question that Councillor Charney asked, if that was enough housing. So it's clear that it's not. So what is any steps moving forward to tackle that gap on housing? Because housing is not a unique issue for Merritt, but across Canada. So, but is there any plans for that in the near future?
Well, no, I mean, it's really the funding programs that we mentioned. So we just closed a call for the community housing fund. We awarded, I think almost 1,000 units in the interior. Fortunately, there were no applications from Merritt. So that's one area that we can work on with local partners, have to bring those projects forward, kind of get them ready. We have funding, we have staff who can work with the nonprofit sector to get projects ready for an award under the community housing fund. That will open again early next year, so we'd love to see some come in. All of those projects that are complete or underway, those came in through that process. So it's a matter of getting everybody aligned and understand where the next target is. So that's the competitive part. We have a program that what was formerly the Housing Hub is now called BC Builds, and that can be much more municipally directed. So there's already a number of sites that BC Builds has put out publicly to build that middle income housing. So that works. The municipality provides free zone land. BC Builds helps to facilitate the due diligence and planning and find a development partner for that work. And then construction and occupancy is supposed to be within 2 years. So really rapid response where BC Housing and the municipality work together to get that done. And then at the lower end of the spectrum for shelter and supportive housing, that's more directed by BC Housing, working in concert with the city to identify locations where that kind of housing or shelter is appropriate, and we'll move those projects forward. We can do that. We're not waiting for a funding call or anything. We can do that when there's an appropriate site that we all move forward.
Councillor Hogan.
So now my second question, let's talk about homeless shelter. So I'm trying to understand partnerships, community partnerships here. So you mentioned in one of your previous slides, the partnership that you guys have with Interior Health. So is there or has ever been discussed the need of additional assistance working with Interior Health to provide that additional support to people in those shelters so that they can, get detox perhaps and, get back into the community?
So we have ongoing conversations with Interior Health in every single community because, of course, health-related services is an important part of what people require when they come into our shelters or are in our housing. So yeah, it's an ongoing issue and we continue to work with health so that you know, if someone identifies that there's a need at the shelter, they can send staff to support that person in the shelter. And it's much easier if there's a place for a clinician to come to, as opposed to trying to find people who are experiencing homelessness in the community. And so the continuity of care is really impacted. And so having a shelter helps with that.
Councillor Bashrosi.
Speaking of people that are living in their vehicles, I guess pretty hard for you to track that, or just looking at how many people are living unsheltered in the community, and that's intense. We don't know how many are actually living in their vehicles, in their cars, which you see them. They are there, so I don't know if there's a way of, if you track that or they contact you to see if there is actually shelter for them, they can move from their vehicle into shelter.
So Tyler just alerted me to the 2023 homeless count. And part of that, I'm thinking 67 or so folks that were sheltered and unsheltered. The unsheltered portion included people that they could find when they were doing their count in vehicles. But in communities where it's smaller, we honestly rely on bylaw. Because bylaw is the boots on the ground individuals who are seeing everything. And they're the ones that know who's where, who's in what vehicle, how long that they've been there. And they're our greatest resource. And so we like to have really solid relationships with folks in bylaw so that we, as shelter providers, we can have that steady communication. So if there's a shelter bed and someone who's sleeping in a car wants to come in, then there's an opportunity for them to do so.
Councillor Cherney.
I look at your numbers there for the unsheltered in Merritt. There are a lot of supports for people that are unsheltered and in the housing units. What supports do you give to the community for the unsheltered people? Because there are a lot of drawbacks to having unsheltered people, a lot of social issues. So what supports do you provide for the community when we have unsheltered people?
So that's why we like to have a really robust shelter service that can respond and is more permanent in nature. It's not in an area that's co-located with other businesses, for example. We try and create shelter environments that don't have that community impact that I think you're referring to. So that's why we like to talk to municipalities about finding sites that allow for that, allow for fencing, allow for controlled access, allow for people to be able to go outside without having to leave the shelter environment. You know, those kinds of things really reduce neighborhood impacts. And that's why every shelter that we have, other than this one where it's co-located and we have challenges with trying to control the space, that's where we like to get to reduce those community impacts that I think you're referring to.
It's not just the shelter, the problems wide when they leave the shelter environment and situations happen outside the shelter. That's what we are seeing.
And our mandate is really around housing and providing either those shelters. Our toolkit also is expanded to outreach and trying to get people into housing in the private market. Some of the outreach that we have, some do go into encampments and try and get people access to basic services if they agree to it. But we rely on other community partners for that community impact. We don't have, we're not responsible for like MSDPR or the health related supports. RCMP bylaw, that it's a community response to homelessness. All community partners play a role and have roles and responsibilities attached to whatever ministry or government entity that, or even a nonprofit.
Councillor Baxter.
What about the youth that couch surf? Do you have studies on those?
So we have some data around youth who to us, that's homelessness. That is being precariously housed. I don't know the data for Merritt, but I can try and see if we have it. But across the, like, especially with youth, it's an emerging group of vulnerable people who are slipping through the various systems, whether it be foster care, justice, residential schools, and the impact of those intergenerational impacts. Those are the people that we see as young people who can't find housing. And so they are sleeping on people's couches. And COVID kind of showed us about that, because as soon as people were at home and unable to, they get kicked out of the couch. That's when all the homelessness numbers increased across our interior region, across the province, probably across the country, although I don't have the data to support it here today. But that's the trend that we saw, is that those who were in precarious housing, that housing was no longer available. And so every single community, our homeless numbers went on the uptick. And that's why we were doing these COVID response shelters everywhere to try and get people inside, because we didn't know the impacts of COVID at the time.
Councillor Egan.
Yeah, I mean, I have about a million questions in my head right now, but I guess that because we're talking about just the one issue of social housing, can you tell us what exactly is the situation at the Merritt Shelter, Val Nicola, or Desert Inn?
So,
So there are some things that obviously impact their ability to do work in the community, that with providers and such. So any of those types of questions, if council would like to go in camera to ask some of those more specific questions, we certainly can do that.
your first presentation here, are you finished at this point? So I guess what we should do at this point is have motion to go in camera for answer some of these questions. Councillor Egan, Councillor Petrosi. Yep. I will read it in a minute. I just want to get the motion.
I'll make the motion that we go
Yeah, yeah.
to discuss further.
Seal.
So your worship, on our agenda, there is a resolution to
Yes.
go into in camera.
I'm going to read that right now.
And there is a section that I have here, if you'd like to add it to that, and that would be the item for discussion of
Yes,
this part of it. So we
we'll
can
move
add
the
that.
shelter discussion into the in camera.
And if we have support of all of council and the resolution to waive notice, then that would be great as well.
Right, so we'll make motion to waive notice and move to bring the shelter question into the in camera. Both mover and seconder okay with that?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the recommendation is that this meeting be closed to the public pursuant to section 91E, the acquisition, disposition, or expropriation of land or improvements. If the council considers the disclosure could reasonably be expected to harm the interests of the municipality, and K, negotiations and related discussions respecting the proposed provision of municipal service that are at their preliminary stages, and that in the view of council could reasonably be expected to harm the interests of the municipality if they were held in public of the community charter. Oh, CO.
And we will add J, information that is prohibited, or information that, if were presented in a document, would be prohibited from disclosure under section 21 of the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
Thank you very much. Mover and seconder okay with it?
Yes.
All those in favor? Opposed? Into camera we go. So we'll give a couple moments here.
Is there an agenda?
Yes.
We didn't get the blue one.
What will?
Thank you.
Well, they have.
We went upstairs and checked and there was nothing in our boxes.